welcome to anyone who's joining us at this moment. Let me just run through a few things as people come in to today's webinar and introduce myself. My name is Suzanne Jeffrey and I am chair of the Campaign Against Climate Change, and I'm chair of our trade union group of the Campaign Against Climate Change also, and I'm going to be facilitating tonight's webinar. It's one of a series. We're in our third webinar in our series of Mapping a Just Transformation, and it's a really fantastic lineup that we have tonight. We've got some wonderful films to show you, and we have some absolutely fantastic guests who are joining us from the US. And just welcome to our guests from the US before we start tonight's webinar. So we're running our third webinar, and tonight we are joined by the filmmaker from Real News, by Sean Day, who's going to be showing us some excerpts from the American Climate Rebels series that Sean and Real News did a couple of years ago. To be honest, the series is incredibly relevant at this moment in time, and that's why it's absolutely so wonderful to have people here, who the activists who took part in the film, and who, of course, haven't left that campaigning from the 2 years ago in which the films were made, but are very, very, very much engaged with either a continuation of that campaigning, or, as we've seen in front of our eyes, the necessity of that campaigning to morph into broader struggles which are kind of tying together all of those systematic crises that we are confronting at this moment in time. So we are in a situation where COVID-19 has exposed those huge inequalities in our society, in which the brutal murder of George Floyd has reinforced that understanding that we are in a society in which there is a small minority that are wanting to maintain their wealth, their power, their profit over everything else, including the health, the well-being of communities, and also of the planet that we live on. But also, I think what we've seen is like a huge appetite for change, and the blossoming of new struggles, which really are showing that we have the capacity and the capability to change this system into something so much better. So welcome to our visitors tonight. Absolutely fantastic that you're here. Just to give a very quick overview of what we'll be doing tonight. So we're going to be showing a film. I'm going to ask a couple of films, actually. I'm going to ask in 1 second for Sean Day to introduce the first film and the series. We're going to watch a 15-minute film showing, and in that film showing you're going to be seeing a number of activists. I'm just going to name check some of those who are with us tonight. So we have Alycia Miles and Ben Hirsch, who are with the West Street Recovery in Houston, Texas, and their work was initiated around trying to establish a just recovery to the Hurricane Harvey, which devastated working class community, well, devastated Houston, but devastated in particular working class and communities of colour in Houston. As I've said, their activism has taken them into the Black Lives Movement, the COVID recovery, and we'll also be hearing, also in that film will be Hilton, Kelley and Michelle Smith, again joining us from Texas. Hi guys, and they're with the Community Empower and Development Association, and have been engaged in activism in Port Arthur, Texas, again in response to Hurricane Harvey, but also the ongoing struggle with the oil and gas industry and the toxic environment created by those industries in Texas. We'll take some Q&A to those people after we've seen the film, and then we're going to move to a second film about Richmond, California. I'll say more about that later, where we have Ratha Lai joining us from the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, and I'll give you a little bit more information about that. So without further, and thanks so much for the well wishes in the chat. It's really lovely that we kind of got a global audience in the chat there. So welcome to all the participants and attendees. And Sean, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks, Suzanne. Yeah, just a very quick introduction to give a little bit of context to this. as Real News, we went over to America a couple of years ago for about 3 months, and the reason for that being we were sort of aware of the climate justice movement in the States that had been going since the 80s. And we knew it was part of a long tradition of brilliant grassroots community organising in the States. We also knew it was led by working class communities of colour. So we'd basically gone over there to learn and see if we could bring that information back. And what we got was a massive education, I think, from the point when we crossed the border from Canada into Buffalo, and we introduced ourselves as trade unionists. And the first person we met in an organisation called Push Buffalo said, by the way, might be best if you don't call yourself trade unionists going around America, because to a lot of people that means racists. And if anyone's confused about why that might be the case, some of that will come out in the next film you see. So we said, what about if we call ourselves anti-capitalists? And they said, no, that will probably be better. And that was the start of our education. That carried on until we met some of the people you're seeing in front of you now in Texas and California 3 months later. So the whole point of it was basically to try and bring back information to try and inject that into the movement here and make that much more working class led than it is at the moment, which from Real News point of view is something that we've always been trying to concentrate on. So I think that will do really. I'm going to share my screen now and we'll get into the first film, which is from Houston and Port Arthur.
The death toll is rising as massive amounts of rain from Hurricane Harvey continue to flood Houston and other parts of Texas and Louisiana. The Houston Police and Coast Guard have rescued over 6,000 people from their homes, but many remain stranded. Meteorologists forecast another foot of rain could fall on the region in the coming days.
Almost all of the city neighborhoods were impacted by the flooding. 55 inches of rain over 2 days. You know, we get 52 inches of rain over a year.
We have neighborhoods that were affected by overflowing reservoirs. We had neighborhoods that were affected by overflowing bayous. And then we also had neighborhoods that were affected when the city decided to open dams and release water from these bayous. And that water filled up neighborhoods also.
It was almost like a water wheel. Part of that storm was in the Gulf and the other part was on land. And as it turned, it was just kicking water off the Gulf right onto the land. Finally, it came to Port Arthur, Texas. It rained like I had never seen before. The raindrops were so tight, it almost looked like it was foggy outside.
Harvey exacerbated and compounded the inequality that existed before the storm.
When it comes to environmental impacts, nobody has been impacted more than people of color, because we were the ones traditionally and historically placed in areas that were deemed unsafe to live. Next to the wastewater treatment facilities, next to the refineries, next to the chemical plants, intentionally placed there. And there are records to prove that.
You're talking about flooding plus the pollution and the emissions from shutdown, startup of these refineries, these chemical plants, and many of these hazardous waste sites, we call them Superfund sites. These are sites that were so dangerous that they had to be placed on a list of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Many of them flooded.
The neighborhoods that have the higher tax property values, they tend to get the assistance faster and first. So it is up to you to get up and take steps towards your recovery and to help your neighbors that need assistance. The worst thing a capitalist society can do is leave people alone to figure it out, because then they figure out they don't need you.
Houston is very segregated by race and by income. 75% people of color, mostly African American and Latino and Asian. And that 25% white population lives separate and apart. The best neighborhoods get allocated to people with money.
We had white flight out of Port Arthur like around 1975, 76 it started. And with white flight went economic opportunities. A lot of businesses shut down, except for the dirty ones like the steel recycling facility here and the refineries. But all the major stores shut down and went more in the white communities. This is where we used to live from 65 to 67. My stepfather got into an argument with a guy just outside this store. And me and my brother was standing outside waiting for him to come out of the store, thinking he was going to bring us some candy and whatnot. And so the guy shot him 5 times right there, and me and my brother witnessed the whole thing. And ironically, I lost my mother to domestic violence as well, shot point blank range in her temple. So gun violence is nothing new in our community. It's been going on a long time. But as long as we kept it in our community, no big deal. Black on black crime, barely an investigation. Blacks had to live on this side of the railroad tracks back in the 50s, well into the 60s. Every now and then you have some white guys that have come through here and run us off the road, and we have to jump down in that trench, or they'll throw something at you. Fucking niggers! I mean, it was common. But if we went to their community and did that, somebody would have got killed. Italians had to deal with a form of racism when they learned to stand up and fight and kill or be killed for themselves, you know. And the African Americans never had that opportunity, because if we ever stood up and one white person gets killed, what happened? They come to the community and hang about 40, 50 people, women and children. It's horrible to look at. White folks standing at the base of it, looking up at them, eating popcorn. One man was torched in front of kids, and still had the rope around it, and they set the body afire where everybody's laughing and parading around the body. I mean, I couldn't do that to my enemy. What kind of a person would do that? And even today, now look at what's happening. Our young people getting shot down don't even have a damn gun. One of the reasons why Black Lives Matter slogan exists, because we are treated as if it don't.
Even just without seeing unarmed black people get killed every week on TV, you already have this post-traumatic stress that if you don't tread lightly, if you don't walk carefully, you can find yourself in a world of trouble. And it could be anything where you talking about, when we talk about marginalized people, a traffic ticket could destroy someone's life. With the way our justice system works, we have people that go to jail for misdemeanors and sit there for years waiting on a hearing for a misdemeanor because they can't make bond. So if I get a traffic ticket and I can't afford to pay it, now I got a warrant for my arrest. Like, that's ridiculous to me. And these are the things that keep people back from seeking help.
This is the south side of the west side. Now, this community here was full of retired teachers and policemen and refinery workers. Now, most of your African-American workers or black workers that worked out there, they couldn't hold operator jobs. They were discriminatory against African-Americans being members of the unions. And if you can't be a member of the union, you couldn't work. Only thing they could do is clean out the oil tanks and do the dirty, subservient work. But they got really good pay compared to the rest of the West Side citizens. A lot of these homes have been here since the 50s. And more and more information came out about the toxic emissions from refineries, the more and more people wanted to get out. But those folks who invested everything into their brick homes, well, you can't really pick up that home and leave. And they really couldn't afford to go to another community and buy a house of that quality outside of West Port Arthur. So many of them were stuck. As you can see, bam, refinery, home. Now look at the storage tank over there in reference to the homes. That's millions of gallons of fuel. One of them it can melt a car 2 blocks away from it. What do you think will happen to these houses? These people wouldn't stand a chance. We had a incident in our ship channel where a ship and a barge collided, and the ship was carrying fuel, and all the fuel wasted out into the ship channel in 2010. And the aroma from that 5 blocks away came into the community. It's almost like you're pumping gasoline, and you couldn't get out of the plume. Cancer rate is high out here as well. Bronchitis, asthma is always there, and not to mention diabetes. You know, people have to get their blood cleaned all the time. I had to count the number of classmates from 1978 that I personally know that have died from cancer. We're in the ballpark of about maybe 13 or 14 of our classmates that have died from cancer. Starting with Jennifer Benson, she was 25 years old. Right there is the Valero oil refinery. This is where the Carbonaries housing project was. In 2007, Valero had a huge sulfur dioxide release. People smelled it about 3 miles away. You couldn't hardly breathe in it. There were 5, 6 ambulances that went out there to pick people up,
bring them to the hospital. We did a protest, a march. We continued to push for them to do things in the community. Finally, each individual that was impacted got compensated. We got a large amount of toxins taken out of the air because of our actions.
This week made 1 year since the German pellet silo caught fire. The silo burned for months and eventually collapsed.
The German pellet company make wooden pellets to burn for heating in Europe. Houses were uninhabitable for a long time because of the odors in the homes. The fire started in April 2017, and it just smelled like wood was burning well into August, shortly before Hurricane Harvey hit. So when Hurricane Harvey hit, now here comes smoke and other toxins from our refineries and our chemical plants. So it's just been one thing after another.
When the hurricane first hit, I'm on Facebook and I started noticing that a lot of calls for rescue were coming from my zip code. And I noticed no one's going to help, no one's coming to this side of town. Now, this is the south side of Houston. It's a predominantly black neighborhood. And so as I sit there, I mean for hours, and I realize, you know, okay, nothing's happening, people aren't being rescued. When rescuers would get on and talk about going to the south side, someone else would hop on and say things like, are you armed? Do you have a gun? What are your assets? Are you, and so to me, that immediately ticked the box for me, like, oh, this is coded language for danger, like a coded way to say, like, hey, don't go over there. And so once I realized that was happening, I got back on my Facebook page and I sent a call out, like, if there's anyone, especially a person of color, that has gone to another side of town, that has decided to go and do rescues on the west side where there are mostly white people, or in one of the rich neighborhoods, know that no one is coming to help your people. My operation cleared 75 families. And once we were done with that, we literally cleared the entire South Loop. We went back out to help them clean their homes out then after the fact. And then we were doing food, working with Food Not Bombs, packaging up tons and tons of meals and driving them down into these neighborhoods. It wasn't like, you know, we sat down and we had this meeting and we decided this is what we were gonna do. By the time we sat down with one another, it was like, all right, guess we're doing this.
Vista, predominantly African Americans that's been here maybe 4 or 5 generations. The water in those homes were 6 to 8 feet high. People almost lost their lives. The Cajun Navy went out into those communities in boats rescuing people. The neighborhoods sit down below the highway, maybe about a good 7 to 8 feet. And so the boats would bring the people up to the road, and then we would help them in the vans and bring them to a shelter.
Many low-income families and working-class families don't have flood insurance, and in many cases don't even have homeowners insurance because of racial redlining, where many insurance companies don't insure families in neighborhoods that they consider high risk. It's hard to even get banks to locate in those neighborhoods, and many of these neighborhoods don't even have grocery stores, supermarkets, those kinds of things.
It's in upwards of thousands of people that are still displaced. I myself still living in a mobile home right now.
Hurricane Ike hit in 2008. Many people never did get compensated for that properly, if at all. And I'm afraid the same thing is going to happen with Hurricane Harvey. The FEMA Blue Tarp from 2008.
It's like 10 years on these people's houses still.
Right. And there's quite a few houses like that.
These people have just mucked their house. Like, the storm was 8 months ago, you know, and those are the flooded materials from their house.
These houses have been mucked, but as far as I know, there's not necessarily a plan to rebuild them. And we see a lot of houses on this street that are actually just empty. There's no walls, there's no flooring, there's just framing. And also, I think that these for sale signs and the we buy houses for cash signs are important too. There's weird speculative stuff that's going on.
There has to be a just recovery and equitable treatment of the communities that are most impacted. To have them in the room talking about what kinds of plans are needed, talking about how we're going to build our infrastructure, from our housing to our businesses to our transportation systems, all of that. Roads and bridges built in a way that allow us to keep our natural areas that absorb the rain, as opposed to allowing developers to build in those areas like they've done over the last 30 years.
Families are the experts on their own recovery, and they know how to proceed. And so we try to make the recovery community-led. We rebuild someone's house, and then they
work with us on their neighbor's house. And then they both work with us on the third neighbor's house. We help people apply to get into the systems of bigger groups and navigate the bureaucratic processes.
You come to this ivory tower with billions and billions of dollars in aid to assist you, and they tell you, we need your deed, we need your tax records, we need your proof of income, we need this, we need that, and folks are like, look, I lost everything. When you should be able to go and get help, you have to think first about all these other class-based, things that could happen, race-based things, immigration status-based things, all these things that would disqualify you, or you may reveal something that puts you in another kind of trouble you don't want to be involved in. So you just withdraw from the process altogether. You don't want to be bothered with it. No organization in their right mind is going to publicize like, hey, we take undocumented people, because then the government will be breathing down their neck. So it takes folks like us to go out and reach out and connect those dots.
And then we also sort of make demands on the bigger groups like, look, this process is unreasonable, which you have. And we've had some success at actually getting those groups to change what they're doing.
We work in solidarity with communities. So it is up to you to take steps towards your recovery and to help your neighbors that need assistance. And then you start to find the genius that exists within your own community. If we're teaching you how to fix your own house, and your 30-year-old son is there, then he can take that skill and make some money. We can take necessary steps not only to beautify our community, but also to lessen the impact of these storms in our community. We're putting rain gardens in the neighborhood we serve in. It might reduce the water maybe 1.5 feet. It might reduce the impact of the next storm. And folks are driving by like, oh, show me how to make one. I want one in my yard. And introducing things like this. I think it is a government's worst nightmare, because when people start to realize that they don't need your scraps to function and that they could create something far better than what you've been giving them if they just work together and work on their own, I think that to me, it's a much more gratifying recovery.
Thanks very much, Sean. And for anybody who hasn't seen the full series, American Climate Rebels, perhaps Bliss or Claire can pop something in the chat. It's really, really well worth watching the whole series. Very, very, very inspirational. One of the things that Alycia said in I don't think it was said in that clip there, but in the full film was, Alycia said, when they leave you alone to figure it out, it kind of, people learn that they can figure it out for themselves, and they know that they realize they don't actually need those in power. Actually, they can create something much, much more effective. And that last comment there about the genius, you discover the genius in your own community. I just wanted to sort of pick that and then perhaps go to ask you to, perhaps Alycia, since I've just name checked you, perhaps if we can start with you, if that's okay, and,
yeah.
And I'll come to Ben, and I'll come to Hilton and Michelle. Maybe 3 or 4 minutes each to sort of bring us up to date. Any reflections on, and just sort of like, where are you now? What kind of lessons have we got in terms of the campaigning? That's, in the historic moment that we're in at this moment in time. So, Alycia, if I can just start with you.
Sure, absolutely. Can you hear me fine?
Yeah, absolutely great.
Okay, great. So so my statement there, I'm still standing strong on that statement. I believe that one thing that has kind of helped me shape that belief even more, kind of going past Harvey and into all of these other natural disasters, I like to call them, which is the connection of the community and the state of communities to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And so when you look at communities that are struggling in multiple or any one area, you notice that, and what I've been noticing is that when I'm looking at a community that has been faced with environmental injustice, racial injustice, over policing, all of the above, and you look at that community based in where they are on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And then when you start to pick that apart, you realize that the systems that are in place politically, the laws that have been created from the dawn of, America, have been created in a way that restricts what these communities have and what these communities are receiving, what these communities are capable of fostering in a general sense. So where a white person would be, if they look at their life on the spectrum of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it'd be like, oh, yeah, I'm struggling with, it wouldn't be anything physiological. It'd be like, yeah, I had a house and a home, and but when you start to talk to poor people and people of color and Black folks who have been put in these situations where they've been abandoned, essentially, you realize they haven't actually been abandoned. What's happened is these laws and these systems have been created to continue a cycle of need. And when you realize that and you break that cycle, so now we have West Street as an organization, we formed two different, we're a part of and have helped to birth two different community organizations within the communities we serve. And as we've helped these community members foster their own and meet their own needs amongst themselves with assistance from us and other organizations, their conversations, when they go and they talk to the policymakers and the lawmakers, the conversations are a lot different. The conversations are, here's what needs to happen. Here's what you need to do. We're not asking you to help us with this, that, or the third. We're telling you this is what needs to happen because we're aware and we figured it out for ourselves. And so when you create that space to empower communities, to empower folks, to really start to, like I said, to start to meet their own needs where they are with whatever they have. They can go back to whoever this entity is that's withholding these things from them and say, this is what I need you to do. And be very clear, because a lot of times you notice when you're having these conversations right now, most recently here locally, when you have these conversations about defunding the police, abolishing the police, the question is always, what do you want us to do? What do you want us to do? Because they don't expect you to have a real answer. So when you formulated the answer and you know exactly what needs to happen, then you go in and you have a very clear picture to paint to whomever. And then the only thing they have left to do is to look you in your face and say, I really don't care. And I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to help you because you've done the work. So then you turn and your community continues to meet its own needs itself, with the assistance of what I always say, smaller organizations that are actually in the community, that know how this works, that engage with the community, that are willing to do the work. For me, I can put that statement I said up against every single issue that we're helping with, from social justice to Harvey recovery to Black Lives Matter, everything across the board. I can put that statement up against it and see the same thing. And I take that statement as my hypothesis to how we will formulate what we're going to do to meet the need, right? So you take that statement and you say, okay, here's what's happening. If they did not exist, if the police did not exist, what would this community look like? Let's work on that. If, this unjust recovery system did not exist, what would recovery look like for this community? Let's work on forming that. And I think that for me has worked. It has worked. I bet Ben can correct me if I'm wrong. But for West Street and for my own, work, and all of the work that West Street is doing, it has definitely worked. So we find ourselves in a lot of different and very unique positions across different movements. I'm assisting with different organizations and doing different things, but it's always in a space where there's an immediate need that needs to be met. And I'm not going to spin my wheels at City Hall. We're just going to hit the streets and we're going to make something happen.
Alycia, you gave Ben the opportunity to correct you if so I think there's something that's formulated in my head as you're talking, and I think I'll just throw it out there before I hand over to Ben. I'm thinking about the kind of experience here during COVID, where literally every single initiative of the government seems to have aimed to line the pockets of some already very rich people, and has been extremely ineffective. Absolutely ineffective. So they launched a call for volunteers to help with the National Health Service, and then they did absolutely nothing. Whilst at the base of society, people got organized, and it's those kind of mutual aid organizations that have delivered the support that people needed. I suppose the question that was formulating, but Ben, let me bring you in. My question was that kind of rank and file grassroots organization, but is it in any way limited? Alycia, I'm just going to put that question for you to ignore or ruminate on. Is it in any way limited by the fact that those in power still have the wealth, which is then denied to us as we try and reconstruct our societies in the way that meet the needs? But yeah, go for it, Alycia.
I know, yeah. I can answer that really quickly. I, as a person who grew up poor, and I think that's been my greatest asset, even in my work in West Street and any other organization that I help organize. What you find in lack is creativity. And there are ways to do things without money. We have to get away from this, what's been put on us as a society, as a culture of, through media, that things have to be shiny and pretty and new, and they have to look a certain way, and they have to speak a certain language in order for them to be viable. Once you can break away from that, you can find that there are many, many, many creative ways to do the job without the funding. And doing the job without the funding is that's the trigger for when, because the thing you have to understand about the funding is at some point, the money gets so big, they got to give it away. And so when they get to that point, when you have when you already have a proven method, you have something that you've already formed and put together, and it's already packaged, and we're showing you proof that this method works, then you can hold your hand out with a way bigger dollar sign in it than you could if you're like, this is my idea, I just need the money to do my idea. It's like, no, here's what we've been doing all this time. And if you could put some money on top of it, we could expand it. But I think from the perspective of starting, like you have to start. Anything that any person of color has, or any person at all, honestly, that did not have an inheritance. I didn't have an inheritance. I don't have rich grandparents. Nobody sowed a seed into my life and said, take this and do what you will with it. I had to figure it out. I had to make do with whatever I have. And so essentially that's what all of these organizations are doing, right? Like, I just got to make do with what I have. You have to be willing to put those resources together to make it work until, but, I think doing what you have doing what you can with what you have is definitely better than doing nothing at all.
Alycia, thanks. I'm going to ask Ben to jump in. Thoughts?
I'll be kind of brief about just direct.
Ben, you have frozen.
Am I unfrozen now? Can you hear me now if I turn my video off?
Yeah, I think that'd be great, Ben, and then we can. Okay. And then.
So one thing that I would say is it is a serious problem that there are literal neo-fascists in charge of the federal government, and Boris Johnson is basically a neo-fascist who's sort of more clever. But I think that is a serious issue, and I don't think that we should ignore that. And your question was, is that an obstacle? And I think, yes, absolutely, it's an obstacle. But I think in this moment of coronavirus and Black Lives Matter sort of uprising, as people on this call have been calling it, it is also important to know that the people who have been in power in England and the US for the last 500 years have basically been different varieties of white supremacists. And that's not really a new thing. And as a white person, is that like harrowing and troubling to deal with that reality? Yes, of course. But it's also a complete necessity if we're actually going to have any sort of interracial collaboration on trying to make the world a more just place, right? Like, is it upsetting to know that my family is from the American South? Yes, of course. Of course it is upsetting. But I mean, if we don't encounter that and don't like really look that in the face in this moment, I don't know if we're ever going to do that. And so I think it is very troubling. And to Alicia's point that you just have to start, I think that's a really good point, that you just have to start, and you can't expect yourself to have the perfect idea of how to solve all the world's problems at once. It's more of, can you bring a group of people together that can solve a problem, and can you build bonds with each other in solving that one problem that strengthen you as a sort of collective social actor to be able to take on the next problem. So if you have a group of friends that muck one house, then can you build trust and build skills in that mucking of one house, so that then you can teach some other people to do that. And then when you do that for a year and a half or 2 years, and then coronavirus happens, how can you use these networks of people that you've built trust and built shared values to deliver the mutual aid that you need? And can those shared values and shared experiences that you've built as a group, can that be enough to fortify you against sort of like the waves of disaster, of fascism, of wealth inequality that are sort of constantly breaking onto you as you try to do this social justice work? So that's what I would say is, I agree with everything Alycia was saying, and I think it's important to focus on the social bonds and the mutual development that you do in a collective effort for justice, so that, because there's always going to be a next effort for justice, right? Like Audre Lorde is like, revolution's not a one-time event. So that's what I would add, is like, it's about building those bonds. And it's about accepting that, like, Alycia and I, who come from very different places, are gonna be in conflict with each other if we work together. If we're genuine and honest with each other, we are going to struggle with each other. And that is a really healthy and important thing. And if we can't have the bravery to do that, and to be brave enough to trust each other enough to be in conflict, we're never going to be able to build bonds strong enough, trusting bonds strong enough to actually overcome sort of the forbearing winds in our society, which are basically white supremacy, destruction of the earth, and, you know, rampant inequality. So that would be what I have to add to that. But I think I'm totally with Alycia in this moment, more than maybe I've ever been.
Thanks, Ben. So maybe a little bit of a note there of some of the realities that there are debates, there are discussions, there is conflict in terms of the necessity to debate and discuss in order to organise effectively and to build unity. I'm guessing that the aim is for that unity in order to make the change. I'm just going to move over to Hilton and Michelle. I noticed that when Ben and Alycia were speaking, that there was a lot of nodding, that you were in agreement with a lot of what Ben and Alycia were talking about. I just wanted to sort of maybe slightly shift a little bit, but feel free to say what you feel is relevant. But I just wanted to shift a little bit in terms of the emphasis in your work on the impact of pollution, the impact of locating poor, Black, working class communities next to very, very toxic industrial premises, and you made the point, Hilton, that with little benefit. You know, it's often sort of the crumbs of employment, but really very little real benefit of being placed next to such toxic premises. I just wanted to sort of ask your thoughts on that, about, you know, has COVID shone any further lights on the reality of those kind of inequalities, health inequalities that you talk about? And also just to ask you, your work also focused on just transitioning away from the oil and the gas industries that play a role in the local industry. And I just wanted any sort of thoughts on where you're up to with that part of your work. Michelle, Hilton, sort of really up to you who responds first.
Okay, well, Michelle, you go ahead first.
Well, to chime in on what you said about the location of the low-income people of color by the fence line. I mean, obviously we see that a lot, and they have very little benefit from it. And to take actually one step further, not only do they not benefit from living right next to fence line communities, they often have an enormous amount of trouble getting hired by these industries, even though the industries get enormous tax abatements for supposedly hiring locally. So that's another thing that we're struggling with. And to add insult to injury, like you already know, the recovery effort and how the funds are distributed are incredibly disproportionate. I can tell you an example. We have a community a little bit north of us called Taylor Bayou, and that's a predominantly white community, affluent. They were allocated, if you even it out over each affected resident, I believe $60,000 in recovery funding per person, per affected person.
Okay.
Whereas the Port Arthur community, which is predominantly African-American, low income, we were allocated $84 per person. So that's a huge gap. And that was just done based on supposedly statistics. So we have that to struggle with as well.
Well, many times what we're looking at when it comes to hurricane damage, when it comes to the General Land Office distributing money to the state, by the time that money gets from the GLO, the General Land Office, to the Southeast Texas Regional Planning, and then distributed between about 12 different counties, Port Arthur being in the 77640 area code and 77642, automatically we get the lower end of the stick. A lot of the money that's distributed is distributed by area code, and they're looking at, number one, your political affiliation. I believe if you are, because we're living in a red state, let's face it, and you have some very strong Congress people that are Republicans that are supporting the communities like Michelle mentioned earlier, when in our community we have I forget his name, Sean. Well, our congressman, he's also Republican, and he knows the district in which the 77640 is in. So therefore, he's not fighting as hard for our community because we're primarily Democrat. And so it's a lot of politics that go into what community gets what and how much. And most of the time, Port Arthur West Side community, which is historically African-American, that's the side of the track literally that we had to live on in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and even up into the early 80s until finally fair housing kicked in. And then we had white flight out of Port Arthur and the houses became available. But those houses that became available, still, we didn't get the support financially because a lot of your banking, we have no banks here in the city of Port Arthur till this day. We have no banks here in the west end of Port Arthur. We have to drive at least, I think, about 8 miles to get to a bank. And it's right on the border of Groves and the Port Arthur Groves border in Midtown. So we have a lot of issues when it comes to environmental inequities. We have financial inequities. All these things are happening at one time. And when it comes to a storm, I remember being in Dallas, Texas, standing in line, waiting to be spoken to with FEMA, by FEMA. And so when FEMA, we finally got to the table, I remember looking up and down that line, and I stood back and I asked my wife, I said, do you notice anything strange about this line? How many white people do you see in this line? And the line was about 3 blocks long, 3 city blocks long. And so she looked up and down the line. I asked a few other people that were with me, and I found it strange that 90% of the people in that line were people of color, but it was predominantly African-American. And then you have a larger population of Hispanic people in that line as well. But it was almost no white, no Caucasian, no Anglos in that line whatsoever. So the question was, what memo did we not get? Where are those people? Because I know we all got hit by the hurricane, but why aren't they in the same line that we're in? Is there a separate line? Is there another process? But yet I know that if we're the minority in the state of Texas, well, where the hell are all the people that were harmed of other ethnicities other than Black and brown? So that's still a question that lingers with me. We are not being treated fairly at all in the state of Texas when it comes to the distribution of support, when it comes to hurricanes, when it comes to support. We just got a explosion here in the city of Port Arthur, the TPC explosion that happened in November. I don't know if you guys heard about it, but the whole plant blew up. It rattled my home. My windows almost blew out, the whole 9. But at the same time, we're still waiting for compensation. What they're doing is starting primarily in the area where the incident took place, which makes sense, which is in the white community. Those people are getting exactly what they're asked for, what they asked for, no questions asked. So the guy comes to my house, so he said, well, I believe that crack was there prior to the explosion, or, well, I just don't think that the damage you have taken on really was due to the explosion. I think that this was maybe your house selling, all sorts of excuses. So he made his notes, he left, and I left it alone. I wasn't even gonna try because I just thought that they wouldn't treat me fairly anyway. But a friend of mine told me who lived a little bit further away from my home, he said, well, Hilton, they really want to take care of you. They gave me $20,000 for that's just a amount. I said, okay, well, maybe a fair shake. But yet, just like I thought, the guy has yet to get back to me, and that was in November of 2019. So it was Thanksgiving, right before Thanksgiving. But with that being said, even during Hurricane Harvey, we had a tough time getting out of the city of Port Arthur. There was very little support. The city was ill prepared, and where the resources were put, it wasn't put in our area here on the west end of Port Arthur. Me and my friend Eddie Brown, we personally went out in our vans and found some high roads to make it to areas that had 5 to 6 feet of water to wait for the Cajun Navy, this volunteer group, to bring them to the road that we could put them in the van and then bring them to a shelter that wasn't flooded, which we found there wasn't many shelters that had not been intruded by water. But yet there was a Carl Parker Center that hadn't been flooded, but it was soon overrun with people that were trying to get out of the flood water. And then the bathrooms started flooding over, and then the food ran out, and now people are outside laying on the steps in the rain. I mean, it was horrible. It was really horrible. And due to the fact that we are living in a hurricane-prone area, I think our city and our state could have been a little bit better prepared for people of color. But I do believe there is a separation when it comes to support for low-income communities versus high-income communities versus what district you live in, because there's a lot of redistricting done every election year to try and incorporate Republicans and Democrats to strengthen their chances of winning. And we are always on the small end of the stick due to the fact that Texas is a red state. So hurricanes, we're always at the back of the line. Explosions at one of the plants when there's injury or pollution being dumped, we're at the back of the line for services for that. There's no equality when it comes to looking out for the health and welfare of people, period. There's always a divide. And this is what pushed us to always say Black Lives Matter, because we're often treated as if our lives don't matter. So those people who say all lives matter, we get that. We get that. But do you get that we should be included in that if you say all lives matter? So that's what we're saying too. Include us, because we have a life. Yes, we are Black and brown, and we're proud to be Black and brown. But at the same time, you say all lives matter, well then conduct yourself as if that is true.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Hilton, you could not have expressed that more clearly, more passionately, and more effectively than you have done. And I think that sense of those who have contributed least to the climate crises that we're experiencing, suffering the greatest impacts of those crises, both here, both in the rich north, but also in the global south, is a reality. And we know that the phrase "all lives matter" is really a way of refusing, denying that racism that you've articulated there. I want to put a question to all of you. But I'm going to leave the question with you, and I'm going to come back to the question because I want to move to the next film. The question in the chat, if you have a minute to look at the chat, there's lots and lots and lots of examples of community organizing, a lot of celebrating of what you have described in terms of your own communities, and examples of similar things happening in the UK. But a question that was put on the chat earlier came from Hester. How could that base of community organization be used to secure more long-lasting and systemic change? So I just want to leave you with that question, and I want to move to the next film, the activism in Richmond, California. The local community there have rebelled against Chevron. I didn't realize what a long history Chevron has in the area. I had no idea about the length of time that Chevron has been dominating the area, both in terms of its pollution, but also in terms of its toxic control over politics. And there was a rebellion against that power and influence of Chevron in Richmond. And Ratha, who is going to speak after the film and is shown in the film, will talk about that, but also the activism that he's been involved with more recently in terms of campaigning for oil justice.
Today here is Our Power Sundays, our weekly bike rides that we host for the community. Riding through these particular parks and neighborhoods, it helps defeat that idea of what shadows our entire city. And this idea is it's always dangerous, always dirty, threatening. So us riding our bikes through that park, you know, it changes people's views, it changes people's perceptions. We had an altercation with the police detaining an individual for whatever reason. Police was immediately swarmed him before any conversation or questions could actually take place. As staff, I don't want my participants to be intimidated. I actually spoke out and spoke to the police to let them know that this is our street. This is our community. We do things here with peace, that is with unity, that is with full communication and full understanding. We have our way of policing our community, and the paid police have their way of policing our community.
Hennessy for my enemies, everybody wanna talk, yeah. I was a nigga that's really just moving around up on the top, yeah. Hey. Everybody wanna keep on talking like they with me, but you know they not, yeah. Hey. I'ma just keep on flipping that shit and I get it, I never flop, yo. Hey. I'm getting it fast, I get it slow, what you want? I'm looking at that shit, but you know I know that you don't. You say that you the shooter, bounce out the whip and you froze, but it's okay, cause you know that everybody gonna know.
I don't need to use no gun, I need to use my mouth. I need to just let all y'all people know what I'm about. I'm a young black man growing up in the rich. I remember all them times when people was getting put in the ditch. Still happening, now I'm really tired and I'm trying to keep going. Like I said, with my breath, I'm finna keep flowing. Now I'm finna yell it loud, I'm finna really scream it. Check it out, boy, I ain't never really been no demon.
The Richmond population is about 110,000. Latinos are about 40%. African Americans are about 22% and declining. Asians are around 15%, but that's an incredibly diverse population. Chinese, Sikh, the Laotian refugee community that came here at the end of the Vietnam War.
Communities of color living here deal with local pollution. There's coal trains, there's so much industrial pollution. We're trying to organize a movement of movements where we can holistically transform our reality, the way we're governed, the way we govern ourselves, the way we choose to be in community with each other, our relationships to industries and practices, to rethink and reimagine all those aspects. Together, we are trying to advance what's called a just transition in Richmond.
As we talk about the just transition, which really emerged out of the labor community, knowing that industries like oil, were facing obsolescence. And so what were their people going to do when their jobs get phased out? But it's also now been incorporated into the broader climate change and environmental justice movement, because when these companies shut down, they're going to leave a tremendous legacy of pollution. Does that mean we get stuck holding the bag even though we've never gotten the benefits? So we want to be able to set a framework, what we call the Just Transition Framework, where there's a planned transition in our economy here in Richmond, led by people who live here in Richmond, so that they actually benefit from that transition.
We can't talk about a just transition without talking about the extractive economy of mass incarceration. Literally, bodies, people as a resource to that system. The Safe Return Project mission is to end mass incarceration of Black people and people of color and re-enfranchise individuals and communities that have been disenfranchised as a result of the carceral state. I'm formerly incarcerated, I'm the director. Our organizers are formerly incarcerated.
Between 1980 and 1995, we built more prisons in California than we had from 1850 to 1980. These people are extracting human beings who can be productive folks in our community, taking them out and putting them somewhere away from our community and making money off of their bodies. They offer some of these people the opportunity to get out by paying them super sub minimum wage to go out there on the front lines fighting fires. So it's essentially like slave labor. We understand that to be part of the overall extractive economy. It's not just about mining and oil drilling and that sort of thing. People are extracted as well.
You're not really a full citizen. So your voting rights are stripped away. You can't access job opportunities. We have accomplished a lot as an organization. We have passed policies making it illegal to ask people about their criminal histories and employment and housing. We have also been able to continuously defeat the expansion of jails. We have been able to divert millions of dollars into resources in this county for people returning from jails and prisons that didn't exist 8 years ago.
This is near the port of Richmond and one of the most environmentally hazardous areas in the city of Richmond. To the left, the big white tanks are operated by Plains All American, the oil company who had the ruptured pipeline in Santa Barbara about 2 years ago. And that was feeding the San Luis Obispo refinery. And over on the right is the CEMEX cement plant, one of the most toxic industries that we do have. This is a Richmond Pacific rail car. This is the company that hauls the coal trains, and that blue unit right to your left, right in the center there, that is where the conveyor belt that hauls both the coal and the petroleum coke off the coal trains into ships that then take it to China and or to Mexico, where they burn it as energy fuel. Petroleum coke is too toxic to be allowed over here as energy fuel, but they allow it to be burned in the refineries and then they ship it to other countries that with less stringent environmental rules. And coming up on the right is Sims Metals Corporation. It's a huge international metal corporation based in Australia. They view this as a recycling operation, but the casual way in which they operate this facility caused a major fire that released dioxins into the community, which is cancer causing and was the real dangerous element within Agent Orange. Chevron is the single largest private sector employer. Its property taxes and other taxes represent about a quarter of the city of Richmond's annual budget, which is about $125 million. But it only hires about 5% local people. Very few Latinos and African Americans get those jobs.
As a redlining practice back in the early 50s, you had policies and people in positions of power still operating under racist values, literally drawing a red line for communities of color to live next to industrial pollutive sources that they later called brownfields, and then to also not give any resources.
Almost every single person in the election committee who live here in Richmond, when they die, the doctor said they died of cancer. And some people have kidney failure, and a lot of kids have asthma.
My friends that were born here, grew up here, lived here, went to school here and worked here, I lost almost 50. And when we went to talk about Chevron expanding, there was a woman from the library that said 12 people, 12 librarians died from cancer. And all of us believe it's because of the pollution Chevron was putting in our water and in the environment.
When Chevron explosion here, 2012, sent 15,000 people in the hospital seeking for treatment, right? So who? The people of Richmond. The people who run the Chevron, they're over there in San Ramon. They're not here.
Chevron has helped destroy part of the Amazon and poison many of the indigenous people in their water down there. Chevron gets 80% of its oil from the Persian Gulf, which is why we had the war over there to steal their oil. And then this oil train represents the threat of crude by rail, which they were trying to bring from North Dakota and from tar sands, Alberta, Canada. For many years, we fought projects anywhere along the rail line that put Richmond at risk and finally stopped all of those projects. We know that this is exacerbating the climate situation. So this is one way where we can interfere with that economy by stopping the transport, therefore stopping the processing.
Chevron has been in Richmond for over 100 years.
In the last 100 years, they've been contaminating everything in terms of the pollution, in terms of the politics around here in Richmond.
We had candidates who basically, passed policies, that Chevron preferred to be passed. No matter how much protesting you did, it was to no avail unless the people who were in office made the right decisions. So we figured that the best way to have people make the right decisions was to put the right people into the office.
Boy, did they use their money and resources to block this from happening. In 2014, this corporation inserted $3 million into a Richmond City Council race. Now, that's a lot of money for any race, let alone a small city council race.
Every single mailbox, every day was getting stuffed with 3 to 4 flyers. Every single billboard was taken up. If you were on your phone, you were gonna run into a Chevron message. If you were on watching TV, you were gonna run into a Chevron message.
Richmond Police Association worked hand in hand with Chevron to create negative information. They say that I can't do a budget, I'm a job killer, I'm an anarchist, I don't show up for work.
In the face of that, the RPA, coalition with several other organizations, knocked on doors, informed voters. Voters began recognizing that we should have leaders that don't take corporate money.
They didn't win any of the people that they promoted. The next election, they basically disappeared.
We're now seeing our city has improved dramatically. Crime is down since we changed the model that allowed a lot of bad cops on the force to a model now that we call community policing. We have the highest minimum wage in the state, $15 an hour next year. We have rent control for the first time in 30 years, as well as more transparency and accountability from Chevron Corporation.
We were able to get a large solar farm built on Chevron property.
It's the largest public-owned solar program in the Bay Area here.
I think the settlement wasn't enough. It is not a win. They would have to pay the medical cost of every Richmond resident for the rest of their life, and their kids and their kids after their kids and their kids after their kids, and they still wouldn't be able to make up for all the health disparities and devastation that they caused our community.
Because of gentrification pressures in San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley, educated white folks with money are now starting to move in, and it's driving prices up.
Gentrification has pushed us away from our communities where our jobs and our resources are. Now we have to commute. Public transportation is almost unaffordable for the people who it was created for. The pollution is becoming a horrible health issue.
We have close to 1,000 people on the streets every night. They can't be in the park, they can't be on a bench, they can't be in a doorway. They get arrested, and if they get arrested so many times, they're going to go to jail, and from jail to prison.
Back in 2015, ACE was working with a building full of tenants that received a 20% increase on their rent. We organized the entire building to fight against the rent increase, but also fight for the repairs that they needed, and things started to get fixed, and we did rent strikes to send out a message that this is an unfair increase. A lot of folks were getting rent increases from $50 to about $600, sometimes double the original rent. As of 2016, we passed rent control and just cause for eviction.
One of the things we've been fighting for in Richmond is more affordable housing, but state laws supersede city laws. As a city, as a municipality, we are not the ones to determine the definition of affordability.
California, supposedly one of the most progressive states, allows refining pollution to increase so long as the industry is willing to pay. Trying to address climate change through a market-based mechanism. Bay Area frontline community members had a solution, and it was to cap refinery pollution at the levels that they are today and to start reducing pollution over time. That was met with significant resistance from the oil industry, but also from our own government. The governor would not allow local air regulators to regulate air quality. And that local agency was about to pass rules to cap refinery pollution that would then protect the local community. You're talking about a state agency taking power away from a local agency.
That's why all the more we need to have representatives at the state level who are not beholden to these corporations, who put people over profits.
We cannot just sit here and complain about Chevron. We have to find a new solution, a new alternative. We don't want the big corporation to take all the solar program. If the Richmond community here can own their own solar and can serve their people here, and it's more local produce, more local use, and more local sustainable. And that is a very important key for the just transition frame.
The city of Richmond has joined other cities and counties in a lawsuit against the petrochemical corporations for knowingly contributing to sea level rise. Fossil fuels are on the way out, And so Chevron needs to be thinking of ways to retrain their employees to move on to other jobs.
The profits Chevron make should contribute to developing job skill.
When we challenged the system of incarceration, people saw it as challenging their jobs. Look at all of the jobs that aren't being done. The jobs we haven't imagined yet that we actually need, that people could do.
A just transition is needed. So how do you do that? Well, you don't have legislators who think they have all the answers. And so for me, that's why it's so important to collaborate with organizations that are doing the work. We have Urban Tilt, they're farmers helping to reduce climate change and teaching how to grow our own food locally.
We decided to host a big town gathering. We called it the Richmond People's Assembly.
Before the assembly happened, there was a huge effort to survey and talk to hundreds of Richmond residents about what their top priority issues were. And it was also really exciting to hear a lot of people of color and Black people talk about pollution, talk about healthy food, and the things that people don't think we care about.
We can come together to collectively leverage our power and then have solutions that are centered on our frontline community members.
Now the follow-up, how do we organize? And how do we now use this resource of all these new people? How do we move the community into what we see locally as Richmond as the best just transition for all of us?
Absolutely fantastic and really, really inspiring. A lot of people commenting in the chat about how inspirational the ideas and the activism and the organisation is, and what a wonderful way to finish with that beautiful piece of artwork coming out of the, or symbolising the People's Assembly, the things that supposedly we don't care about, except we do. This is what it is all about, us living lives that are happy and sustainable and in which we look after each other. Ratha, can I ask you for your comments on what we saw in the film, but also like what's happening now?
Yeah, so I thank you for having me. And I think first off is like, I'm here representing a lot of other folks as we saw on the film. So in no way do I work alone. And I've worked across a lot of different organizations. So I'll try to shout out as many different organizations as I can. But from the film, it was really about seeing like a lot of different organizations who are being impacted and being harmed and being burnt with not just Chevron, but being burnt by a police system that incarcerates and targets vulnerable people who are majority Black people and take them out of our communities. And we're constantly seeing everyone in our community being exploited in every possible way possible. And everybody's always trying to have to deal with that. And what we started to do was think about how can we come together as a coalition to, one, help strengthen each other, and then two, start to figure out how can we actually undo and solve this problem. I transitioned out of that role and I turned into an independent consultant, and I started working with the Safe Return Project, who is also featured in that coalition. And from there, I think what we started to see was when COVID-19 hit, was we knew that our communities were going to be exploited again. We knew that that was going to happen. We knew it was only going to be a matter of time. And what we really had to start to think about was, how do we reimagine safety in our community, and how do we do it by organizing? How do we stay organized? You know, I really believe that having an organized community can keep your community safe. And that means that we're able to identify different threats and things into our community. And the biggest threat, and I was talking to family members, and I want to get real personal because it was just hearing all the dialogue between, yes, and I agree from the earlier conversation, if you say all lives matter, you're basically neglecting Black lives. And I don't think that statement is in solidarity at all, or acknowledges the fact that we have a community that consistently gets targeted and terrorized in this country for years and years and has to deal with that. And for us, we have to think about how do we stand in solidarity with each other, because it's not right for our brothers and sisters to get targeted just because of the different things of how of these conditions transpired. And so working with Safe Return Project, we really started to understand, like, when George Floyd was murdered and all these protests started to hit, it was understanding what the justice means, right? What does justice means, right? Because in our communities, it wasn't, the terror also came from the cops, because it was going into our communities and understanding that at any moment, if you were stopped by a cop, you could have your life completely changed and taken away and turned for the worse. And that was something that we started to think about. And I think that's when they did a great webinar called Black Hurt Matters, because it was talking about how much that, but yeah, definitely check them out for the Safe Return Project. And I think one of the other things that we really came to mind and come to awareness of, and I think the film really captures it, is understanding that we're in the pathway of profit for Chevron and the oil industries. And so what we ended up finding out, and what we're finding out, is that no matter how much organizing or everything that we do, Chevron and the oil industry will not give up California or give up anywhere on the coast, because we are in their pathway to profit. And so that brings the dilemma on for more frontline communities, because one, we're understanding, like, not only do we have to deal with all of this, we're also trying to seek justice as well. Justice for living in a community, for having to deal with seeing a refinery that makes billions of dollars off of my deteriorating health, my family's deteriorating health, my community's deteriorating health, and how that impacts us on multiple levels, including our politics. So, I think the video captures everything really well. And I think the moment that we're in right now is recognizing that, crises are going to keep continuing, but the faster we organize, the better we organize, the more we're going to be able to stay together. So I really appreciate how we're seeing other frontline communities. As a frontline community organizer, I think y'all can empathize, and like, having to rally our community together is also hard, because our communities are like literally hurting so much. And to have to heal and then bring us together and to understand is like healing and empowering at the same time. And I think that's what we're seeing across more and more communities. And I hope that continues, and I hope the solidarity continues. And I think for here in Richmond and the rest of California, what we're beginning to do is to even organize even bigger, is to organize across other cities, other counties, and to understand, right? To understand and recognize, like, where the oil industry are, what is it that they're interested in, and how is it that who represents them, and then also the club and the network that gets associated with that, right? That gets associated with the oil industry, that gets associated with propagating the exploitation of people of color. And so I think it's becoming more aware of that, and then learning how we can have more solidarity, and then become more politically organized. And I think that's why we're seeing such a big political assault on our politics and our elections everywhere, is we're seeing more difficulties across the country on just to participate in election. And so I think that there's a reason why, folks, I feel like growing up, it was really hard for me to see myself as a voter, until I started getting burnt with more and more of the struggle, and I got politicized. And then I learned, like, it wasn't enough to vote, I had to start organizing. And that's where I feel like we're really, we're at. Is the more organizing that we can do, the faster we can do it. It's like we're kind of running out of time. And I think what we're trying to do is to make sure is that we want to take every opportunity we can. And part of that also is, like, when I work with organizers, is helping us release ourselves of finding the solution, and understand that we're in service of making our livelihood better. And we have to be present in that moment and in that service. And this work that we're doing is borrowed, and it will end, and we will pass it on to the next generation. And it was really being able to release having to solve the solution that really was able to allow us to be present and understand how are we being harmed, how can we come together, and how can we address that. So prisons being built, no, that's not going to happen. People being impacted by different policies and laws that get them into prison or have unfair incarceration laws or penalties or laws that are unfair, that needs to end and that needs to get undone. I think what we saw as a coalition as well was when we connected with other groups, like for example, in Kentucky, was we saw that in Kentucky, we saw coal mines shutting down. And as coal mines were shutting down, the community fell into poverty. And then what we started to see as we visited there, I think like a couple of years ago, was that the private prison industry was trying to move in. Was that they were trying to move in and replace the coal companies and have jobs and trying to sell the community that the prisons would also bring in hotels, and this would be a whole commerce and everything. And the community there is dealing with a drug epidemic, heroin epidemic. And so they're also met with understandings like, wait a minute, are you trying to also incarcerate us? So what we're seeing is like the exploitation isn't gonna stop on our communities everywhere. And what I hopefully hope to see is that as we continue to, as more people become more activated, we see more change happen. And as more change happens, I just want to be present as much as I can and help as much as I can, and then figure out how we can rally each other and continue making change happen. But I think it's so strong to have that solidarity and community, because I feel like it's so hard to always try to see the solution, but understanding that the solution has to come with solidarity first, right? Because that's how a lot of this stuff got messed up in the first place, right? We have solutions that exploit people in favor of other people, versus having solidarity and then figuring out what is the mess that we have to go through, what is the justice that we have to rectify, and how do we speak up for those who haven't had the chance to speak up for. Yeah.
Thanks, Ratha. Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. So much covered there. So many important things. You said we're running out of time, and we are, in terms of the climate crisis, not least of everything that we're dealing with in terms of the crisis. You said that they're not going to stop because we're in the pathway of profit. And that's so so important. And then you spoke about the range of demands that are being thrown up for huge systemic change. And I think that mural in the film was a fantastic mural, which brings together the kind of power of profit to make war in one part of the world for the oil, to destroy the environment, the lungs of the world that we and in the Amazon, and then to create toxic, polluted circumstances for people of color, in the richest part of the world. So can I finish on this? We're kind of try to bite off more than we can chew in terms of the limited amount of time and the films and the great contributions. Can I come back to that question of systemic change? How does this inspirational community organization that everybody's spoken about lay the basis, or does it not need to lay the basis for bigger systemic change? And I'm going to go to Alycia first up. And while Alycia just has a minute to think, Ratha, in the chat, somebody asked for the Just Transition framework that was referenced in the film. So I wonder if it's possible to put that in, a link to that Just Transition framework. Alycia, and then Ben, Alycia, thoughts, or speak to what you think is more important.
I think the question in itself is a really beautiful question, specifically because the thing that you'll find is missing. So I like to think of community organizing and social organizing in the concept of a wheel, right? And so you have all of these folks that are in this wheel, which are all these different community organizations doing tons of different types of work, because like Ratha said, the attacks in our communities don't stop, they just change. Always something different. So what likely is missing, and this is kind of across the world, is someone who's willing to be the hub of that wheel, right? All of these organizations need to connect somewhere. There needs to be someone that is willing to just be the hub of that wheel. And it's one of those things where it's like you transition from, my organization does this to like my organization organizes. Like, that's just what I do. I organize. I'm really good at it, and I can do it across many different spaces, many different types of organizations. They all need to be organized. So someone has to be willing to be the hub of that wheel, to connect all of those pieces so that the movement can move forward. So I think for me, that's the one thing that we don't focus enough on. That's the one thing that we don't give enough energy towards, is figuring out who can be that hub, or what organization can just do that. Like, I'm really good at I know that they're doing this here, they're doing this over there, they're doing this over here. I can put this together and make something really powerful. And that for me is what will kind of shift, that'll cause that shift in because it's one thing to be one grassroots organization in one small community in one giant city. It's a whole nother thing to be a collective of organizations that is connected by one person or one organization whose responsibility it is to keep everybody connected and to keep the movement moving forward.
Thanks, Alycia. And one of the things that's happened is kind of the fact that we're having this conversation. I think the struggle of the last few months is kind of reconfigured that kind of internationalism that is part of our history as social movements that fight for change, that we're learning from each other again and thinking about ways that we can organize together and build that kind of connectivity that you talked about. Ben, to you, please.
Yeah, really briefly, I mean, I think that as movement people, whatever word you want to use, we have to come face to face with the fact that we are too small and that we don't have enough people, and there aren't enough fighters, and there aren't enough healers and teachers among us who are really oriented towards justice. And I think I don't mean among organizers, I mean in the general population. How many people in America, 320 million people, actually would care about this conversation at all? It's not enough. And what I think that if we're going to be sustainable, if we're going to be building to something, one of the questions we always have to keep asking ourselves is, as we pursue our narrow campaign goals, we want to rebuild 10 houses this year, we want to shut down this one pipeline, how are we using those targeted efforts to have a more long-term vision of how many more people can we engage in this struggle, how many more people can we build capacity for, how many more people can we train, so that when we end that one campaign, we're even stronger as we come to our next campaign. And I think for those of us who are organizers on this call, the really tricky thing about that is to successfully include people and make them feel empowered and to make them feel impactful, we need to give up some of our own power within these movements, and we need to be constantly trying to be as flat as possible. So sometimes it's really nice to be invited onto this panel, right? And you get a certain sense of self from it. But at the same time, and that feels good, and work that's underpaid, that's a nice thing to have, right? But if we really are trying to include more and more people, that means a lot of times we need to think about being more leaderful instead of having as many leaders as we can and building up people's capacity to do that. And that means sometimes that we're going to have to move slower than we want to in certain moments so that we can move stronger. And I would say it's that balance of how do you balance some very important goal, like we're going to prevent this prison expansion, or we're going to prevent this LNG port, with a much bigger goal of we only have 1 million people in America that care enough about this, and we need to make that number 150 million or we're really screwed. So I would say that's the thing, is how can we always be growing? And that's the challenge as an organizer.
Thanks, Ben. Michelle, Hilton, is that the issue? How do we keep growing?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've been doing this work now 21 years, and I've been a member of quite a few coalitions. The Coming Clean Coalition is one of them that comes to mind. I work very closely with Earth Justice, which is a policy group. I've served on the Environmental Justice Advisory Council to EPA. And with that said, I think I can bring some history to the table to assist. But I think that, you know, just for this conversation, I believe that that common thread is what can pull people together. Of course, yes, we have refinery issues, but we also have hurricane issues. We also have systemic racism issues. And same holds true in Richmond, California. I've worked in Richmond, California with folks in the Oakland Ship Channel. I'm working with Lawrence Holliday now in Richmond. I don't believe you know him, but yet they reached out to me some years ago. So it's great that you're there. But at the same time, we have to find that common thread that sort of unites us all and get an understanding of how we can work together on that specific issue. Because what I found when you work in these large coalitions is that everybody's got their sign up. Oh, you know, no, don't use makeup. Stop the rainforest. Stop drilling for oil. You know, stop racism around the world. And then your message sort of gets clouded and lost in a whole conglomerate of people, but because nobody really stopped to say, how can we work together cohesively? Now, there's another way without finding that common thread, I believe, providing we could find a common thread, we unite those people that are for refineries. We unite those folks that are standing strong against police brutality. We unite those guys who are standing together and that are strong against the rainforest being totally annihilated. And then we, like you said, that spoke in the wheel. That spoke in the wheel is about finding the resources to help each one of those groups that can accomplish their goal with the support of that spoke in the wheel and all the groups sort of providing the resources or ideas or information about where the grants are to help them to stay strong. I think that's where we're gonna be able to move forward a lot quicker, is by partnering people together. Let's just say we pulled in 3-4 million people, and then we find out, okay, who's all on board against refineries and chemical plants? Who's all on board against, you know, cutting the rainforest? Who's all on board about, you know, getting women to stop using toxic makeups? And then we pocket those people together and put them in a group. Now we've got all those 2 million people kind of like in different groups that are strong in their own right. And then we find ways of supporting them with the resources they need to build those campaigns and to go out and fight those campaigns. This way, we'll be able to fight more than 1 or 2 battles at a time by finding a way to support those various groups at the same time. So finding a common thread between a large body of people and partnering them all together is what I think needs to happen.
Hilton, thank you. Michelle, I'm going to hand the floor to you for a minute. Your thoughts, please.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, because I think Alycia, Ben, and Ratha all made excellent points, as well as Mr. Kelley. What I've also seen on the ground is the threshold for people to hop on board. I mean, I think in most cases, everybody understands to a certain extent racism, but I think that a lot of times when you add elements to that and it gets the message gets kind of clouded, people get overwhelmed. So with everything that they already have going on in their lives, Alycia mentioned the Maslow's pyramid of the hierarchy of needs. They're trying to make sure they're covered on the basic things first before they move on to the next thing. And I think a lot of times when we speak in technical terms and we overwhelm people with all these ideas and all these issues and all these problems we're trying to solve, it overwhelms them and they pull back. So I think that sometimes lowering the threshold for just regular folks, regular community members to hop on board and join in is very important too, along with tying it all into a hub.
Thanks, Michelle. Ratha, you're going to have the last word. Before you speak, there's a request for people to put any Twitter accounts into the chat so that people can follow you guys after this conversation. Ratha, I'm going to give you the last word before I wrap up, and we've run out of time and it's far too short. But Ratha, a couple of words from you, please.
Yeah, I think what everybody said was absolutely right. I think Alycia hit it right on the head in terms of having that hub. And for communities, like, we just have to self-select someone to be that center person to caretake over and help build the coalition. And that means talking to everybody and spending that time to spend those one-on-ones and then bring the meetings together and go through a lot of really messy stuff. I don't think there's any coalition anybody anywhere would say that would be a really fine run smoothing coalition that had no problems at all. It's actually really messy, however, very necessary. And I think it's something that we're really learning to do. And I think as long as we understand that, and there's a reason why coalition building, community organizing is excluded from the economy, from the job market, from being resourced as a profession or as something that's essential for our livelihoods. And it's something that us communities of color and frontline communities are forced to have to do as a means to defend ourselves, right? It's to organize communities so that way we can recapture power and build coalitions to retake power in our political spaces. And it's a long journey. However, as more communities become activated, what we're seeing is like, yeah, our government and the people who have been in power for the last decades or whatever you want to call it, you are responsible for the mess we are in now. And it's time for our folks to be able, it's time for our leadership to reflect our communities and our actual communities' needs. So get organized, start organizing.
Brilliant, Ratha. Get organized. What more can we say? Thank you so much to all of you. It's one of those conversations where, yet again, I feel like I've learned so much. I feel like we're part of an international struggle. I don't know if other people feel that. I feel like we're part of now a global struggle for some serious change. This system needs to end, and we need a different kind of society. And it's great to feel that we're part now of an international community struggling for the change that we need. Thank you to Alycia Miles. Thank you to Ben Hirsch. Thank you to Hilton Kelley. Thank you to Michelle Smith. Thank you to Ratha Lai. And solidarity with you all.